The sound didn't belong. My evenings on the dock were a curated silence. Tide lapping against pylons, the distant hum of the mainland, nothing else. Then a sharp, violent splash shattered the rhythm. I stood, wineglass forgotten on the railing, scanning the darkening water. A flash of yellow plastic bobbed in the current, a kayak, belly up. Then an arm broke the surface, thrashing against the outgoing tide. No shouting, just the desperate, wet sound of a gasp cut short. I didn't think. I kicked off my loafers and hit the water. The cold was a physical blow, a sledgehammer to the chest. October water in the Sound isn't forgiving. It seizes your lungs and tightens your skin instantly, turning breath into a luxury. I surfaced, gasping, the salt stinging my eyes like acid. The current here is deceptive, a smooth, glassy surface hiding a heavy, muscular pull toward the open ocean. I saw her head bob, dark hair plastered across her face like seaweed, fighting a losing battle against the undertow. "Kick!" I yelled, the water filling my mouth, tasting of brine and fear. She turned, eyes wide and white in the gloom, panic stripping away any coordination. She was flailing, heavy in wet clothes that dragged her down. I closed the distance, the water churning around us like a washing machine. When I grabbed her life vest, she nearly took us both down, instinct overriding reason, limbs thrashing. "I've got you," I gritted out, hooking an arm under hers, clamping down hard. "Stop fighting me." The swim back was a slog. The water wasn't just cold, it was a thief, stealing heat with terrifying speed. Every yard felt like a mile, the tide dragging at our legs, trying to reclaim the prize. My muscles burned, a sharp lactic fire, but the adrenaline held the cold at bay. I focused on the rhythm of my strokes, ignoring the burning in my lungs. We hit the ladder, slick, barnacle-encrusted wood that scraped my palms, and I shoved her up first. She collapsed onto the weathered decking, coughing up seawater, her body heaving with the effort of breathing. I hauled myself up after, water streaming off me in heavy rivulets, pooling on the gray wood. For a long minute, the only sound was the wet slap of waves against the pylons and her ragged coughing. The air felt thin, charged with the proximity of disaster. I knelt beside her, checking the pulse at her neck, automatic, precise. Her skin was ice cold, clammy under the soak. She was wearing layers meant for a light paddle, not a swim. Heavy cotton that now weighed 50 pounds wet. She swiped hair from her eyes, shivering violently, teeth chattering a staccato rhythm against the silence. "You're okay," I said. Not a question, but a command to the universe. She looked up then. Even in the fading light, her gaze was arresting. Dark, dilated pupils, lashes clumped together, a raw, unflinching vulnerability that hit me harder than the cold. She didn't look away. Most people apologize or look at the ground when they've just been pulled from the brink. She just stared, drinking in the sight of me, the dock, the reality of air in her lungs. There was a terrifying openness in that look, a lack of barriers that usually take years to dismantle. "My boat," she managed, voice wrecked by salt. I glanced out. The yellow hull was a distant speck now, riding the fast lane of the channel toward the Atlantic. Gone. "It's halfway to the point by now," I told her, keeping my voice low, steady. "Forget it. It's just plastic." She shivered again, a full-body tremor that rattled her jaw. The adrenaline was receding, leaving the cold to settle into her bones. Her lips were turning a dangerous shade of blue. We were exposed out here, the wind picking up across the water, carrying the scent of ozone and incoming rain. The isolation I usually prized suddenly felt dangerous. "We can't stay here," I said, standing and offering a hand. The wet denim of my jeans clung heavy and cold. "My house is up the hill. You need heat, now." She hesitated, looking at my hand, then up at the dark outline of the house on the bluff. It was a fortress of privacy, usually forbidden ground, but the ocean had rewritten the rules tonight. She took my hand. Her grip was weak, trembling, but the skin contact was electric, a sudden jolt of warmth in the freezing damp. I pulled her up, her weight sagging against me. "Can you walk?" "I think so," she whispered. Lean on me. I wrapped an arm around her waist, feeling the shudder of her ribs against my side. We turned away from the black water, toward the steep path leading up. The rescue was over, but the night, and the storm, was just beginning. The path up from the water wasn't built for urgency. It was a goat track of crushed oyster shells and railroad ties, winding through a dense thicket of scrub oak and sea grapes that clung to the hillside with desperate, gnarled roots. Usually, I took this route slow, a meditative transition from the wildness of the sound to the curated silence of my home. Tonight, however, it was an obstacle course. Her weight was significant against my side. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. I could feel the tremors running through her frame, violent shudders that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air and everything to do with the shock settling into her marrow. The humidity here, sheltered from the wind by the bluff, was oppressive, wrapping around us like a wet wool blanket, heavy with the scent of decaying leaves. "Stay with me," I said, my voice rough. She didn't answer, just dug her fingers into the wet denim at my waist, her knuckles white. We moved as a three-legged creature, awkward and out of sync. Her boots slipped on the slick, mossy ties, and I had to tighten my grip, my arm a steel band around her ribs. The intimacy of it was jarring, the way her cold, wet side pressed into my warmth, the way her ragged breathing synchronized with mine. It was a forced closeness, born of disaster, but the sensory impact was undeniable. I was hyper-aware of the curve of her hip, the sharpness of her shoulder blade, the sheer fragility of her life in my hands. Above us, the house loomed against a sky that was rapidly bruising purple and black. It was a modern structure, angular and imposing, a fortress of cedar and glass designed to disappear into the tree line. I had built it for privacy, a glass and timber vow of silence. Bringing someone here felt like a violation, but looking at her profile, pale and stark against the gloom, I knew the rules didn't apply tonight. The wind picked up as we crested the ridge, no longer blocked by the trees. It whipped her wet hair across my face, stinging my cheek. The smell of ozone was overpowering now, that distinct scent of lightning burning the air. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, hitting the broad leaves of the magnolias like bullets. The sky was ready to break open. She looked up at the house, then at me. Her eyes were dark, dilated pools in the low light. There was gratitude there, yes, the raw, animal relief of survival. But there was also a sharp wariness, a calculation happening behind the panic. She was a woman alone, wet and vulnerable, being led into a stranger's secluded home as night fell. I saw her throat work as she swallowed the fear. "It's just me," I said, reading the tension in her shoulders. "Just the house and the storm." She nodded, a jerky motion. "Okay." We reached the main deck, the final hurdle. The stairs were steep, slick with sea mist. I took most of her weight, practically lifting her up the last few risers. When our boots finally hit the solid, flat decking, the relief was palpable. We were under the deep overhang now, sheltered from the vertical fall of the rain, though the wind still drove the mist in sideways. I steered her toward the far side, away from the glass doors leading to the living room. "Not inside yet," I said, guiding her toward the cedar screen that hid the outdoor shower. "You're freezing, and you're covered in the sound. We need to get you warm before anything else." She leaned against the railing, her chest heaving, water pooling around her boots. She looked wrecked, beautiful in a terrifying, raw way, and completely at the mercy of the elements. And me. The outdoor shower wasn't an affectation of coastal luxury. It was a practical necessity, born of salt and sand, tucked discreetly behind a high wall of slat cedar on the far side of the deck. I steered her toward it, the wood underfoot slick with the blowing mist. The enclosure was private, sheltered by the house on one side and the dense, wind-twisted scrub oaks on the other, but open to the sky above the slats. "Get in," I said, my hand leaving her waist to pull the heavy copper handle of the door. "The water heater is tankless. It won't run cold. Don't come out until you stop shaking." She looked at the steam already beginning to rise from the drain as I twisted the valve, a white ghost curling into the dark, wet air. She nodded, a jerky, fragile movement, and stepped inside. I heard the latch click, a small, definitive sound that separated us. I turned and went into the house through the sliding glass doors. The silence inside was instant and jarring. The storm was reduced to a visual abstraction against the floor-to-ceiling windows, the wind just a vibration in the glass. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. The gloom felt safer, more contained. I moved through the living room to the bedroom, the adrenaline in my own blood beginning to cool into a sharp, focused clarity. I needed to cover her. I pulled open the heavy drawer of the dresser, the wood groaning softly. I bypassed the silk, the structured linens, the things I wore to keep the world at a distance. I wanted softness, texture that would forgive. I found a charcoal t-shirt, washed 100 times until the cotton was practically fluid, the kind of fabric that loses its shape to take on yours. Then a pair of gray sweatpants, thick and fleece-lined, with a drawstring that had frayed at the ends. I grabbed a pair of wool socks from the top shelf, heavy and dense. Holding the bundle against my chest, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My hair was wild, plastered to my skull, my own clothes dark with water. I looked like I'd been fighting the ocean. In a way, I had. I walked back into the humidity. The air on the deck felt heavier now, charged with the negative ions of the storm and something else, human proximity. I walked to the cedar screen and stopped. The shower was running full blast. I could hear the heavy, rhythmic drumming of water hitting the wooden floorboards and the softer, broken sound of it sluicing over skin. Steam billowed over the top of the enclosure, mixing with the cold rain, carrying the scent of the eucalyptus soap I kept on the shelf. I stood there, clutching the dry clothes. She was 3 feet away, naked. The cedar slats were a visual barrier, but they did nothing to stop the sound or the knowledge. I listened for the cessation of her shivering, feeling like an intruder in my own space, while a stranger washed off the salt of a near-death experience. The proximity made the hair on my arms stand up. I waited until the water turned off. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the drip of the eaves. "I have clothes," I said, my voice sounding deeper than usual, pitched to carry through the wood. "Okay," she replied. Her voice was stronger now, the tremor gone. I reached around the edge of the screen, keeping my eyes on the horizon, where lightning pulsed inside the clouds. I held the bundle out into the void. A hand appeared, pale, wet, steaming slightly in the cool air. Her fingers brushed mine as she took the fabric. The contact was brief, a wet, hot collide with my dry skin, but it sent a shock through me that had nothing to do with static. It was intimate, unflinching. "Thank you," she said softly. I pulled my hand back, rubbing the damp spot on my palm against my jeans. "I'll be on the porch." I retreated to the sunroom, leaving her to the ritual of dressing. I needed the distance. I needed to reset the boundaries that the ocean had so violently erased. But when the door to the shower opened a few minutes later, and she stepped onto the deck, I knew boundaries were going to be a problem. She stood there, scrubbed clean, her skin flush pink from the heat. She was drowning in my clothes, the shirt slipping off one shoulder, the pants pooling over the wool socks. She looked ridiculous. She looked devastating. The wild, panicked creature from the water was gone, replaced by someone softer, someone wearing my life like a second skin. She looked at me, and the air between us tightened, pulling taut with a tension that was sudden, undeniable, and terrifyingly real. The sun porch was less a room and more a negotiation with the elements. A space I had designed to feel like the exact midpoint between the civilized world and the wild salt marsh. It was screened in on 3 sides with heavy-gauge bronze wire that had turned a distinct verdigris green over the years, a color that matched the unruly collection of ferns and monstera plants that claimed the corners. Even with the storm shutters partially lowered, the room felt alive, a glass lung breathing in the humid, charged air of the coast. The floor was rough-hewn slate, cool underfoot, and the furniture was deep, low-slung teak, buried under piles of moss-colored velvet cushions. It was a place for reading, for drinking dark wine, and for silence. I opened the sliding door and ushered her in. The sound of the rain changed instantly, shifting from the distant drumming on the roof to a loud, immediate hiss against the screens. The wind rattled the frame, a physical pressure that made the plants sway in the draft, their shadows dancing frantically against the beadboard ceiling. She stepped into the space, and the room seemed to reconfigure itself around her presence. Seeing her in my clothes was a sensory disorientation I hadn't prepared for. The charcoal t-shirt, which usually skimmed my waist, hung off her shoulder, exposing the sharp, pale line of her clavicle and the damp tendrils of hair clinging to her neck. The gray sweatpants were rolled at the waist, the drawstring pulled tight, bunching the fabric around her hips in a way that looked impossibly soft. She looked like a ghost of my own lazy Sunday mornings, yet entirely, vividly herself. There was a dissonance to it, my history wrapped around her immediate, shivering reality that made my mouth go dry. "Sit," I said, gesturing to the daybed that dominated the far wall. "It's the warmest spot. The cushions hold the heat." She moved tentatively, her socks sliding on the slate, and sank into the velvet. She pulled her legs up instantly, tucking her knees under the hem of the shirt, curling into a ball of borrowed cotton and exhaustion. I watched her, struck by the composition she made, the storm-battered stranger nestled in the heart of my sanctuary. The air in the porch was thick, heavy with the scent of old cedar, wet earth from the potted plants, and the sharp, metallic tang of the ozone drifting through the mesh. I clicked on the standing lamp in the corner. It cast a pool of warm amber light that barely cut the gloom, creating a sphere of intimacy that felt sealed off from the rest of the house. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The awkwardness I had expected, the polite, stilted conversation of strangers thrown together by disaster, didn't materialize. Instead, a different kind of silence settled over us. It was dense, textured. I moved to the armchair opposite her, sitting on the edge, keeping a careful distance that felt increasingly academic. I was hyper-aware of the sound of her breathing, which was slowly evening out, syncing with the rhythm of the rain. The contrast was jarring. Outside, the world was tearing itself apart. The wind howled through the eaves, a low, mournful note that vibrated in the floorboards. Rain lashed the screens in violent sheets, blurring the view of the ocean into a gray, churning abstraction. But inside, in this amber-lit pocket, there was a stillness that felt fragile, held in place only by our collective refusal to acknowledge the strangeness of the situation. I watched her eyes track a drop of water sliding down a fern leaf. She looked up, catching me observing her, and for a second, the guard dropped. Her gaze was direct, stripped of the earlier panic, replaced by a curiosity that mirrored my own. The heat of the shower seemed to radiate from her, crossing the 3 feet of slate between us. Then, the storm made its move. A crack of thunder, close and deafening, shook the house to its pilings. The amber light in the corner buzzed angrily, flickered once, plunging us into total darkness, then surged back to life, dimmer than before. She flinched, her hand flying to her throat. "The grid is fighting a losing battle," I said, my voice low, trying to anchor the moment before the lights gave up entirely. I stood up, needing to break the static that had built up in the silence. If we're going to be in the dark, we should probably be prepared. I have a bottle of Pinot Noir that breathes better without electricity. She let out a breath, a small, shaky laugh escaping her lips. "I think I could use a drink." "Stay there," I commanded softly. "I'll be right back." I returned with 2 glasses and the bottle, the cork already drawn with a soft pop that was swallowed instantly by the roar outside. As I stepped back onto the cool slate floor, the sky finally tore open in earnest. It wasn't just rain anymore. It was a deluge, a solid vertical wall of water driven by a gale that screamed around the sharp corners of the house. The bronze screens, usually so sturdy, bowed inward under the immense pressure, the mesh hissing violently as the water struck it. The world outside had vanished completely. There was no dock, no ocean, no horizon line to orient us. There was only the gray, violent swirl of the storm and the fragile, amber-lit pocket of this room. The bridge to the mainland would be impassable by now, the low causeway flooded by the tidal surge. We were an island within an island. The realization should have been claustrophobic, but instead, it felt clarifying. The roar of the wind narrowed the universe down to the 20 square feet of slate between the velvet daybed and my leather chair. I set the glasses on the low teak table, the wood dark and grained. In the dim, flickering light, the wine looked black, heavy with potential. I poured. The sound of the liquid filling the crystal was distinct, a rich, glugging note that cut through the white noise of the rain like a bell. I filled them generously. We needed the ballast. I handed her a glass, the stem cool against my fingers. Her hands were warmer now, pink returning to the skin, but she still held the glass with 2 hands, cradling the bowl as if it were a talisman against the chaos raging just inches away. She wasn't looking at me, though. She was staring out at the dark, her eyes wide, reflecting the occasional jagged flash of lightning that illuminated the thrashing palms in the yard. I watched her watch the storm. There was fear there, certainly, the primal fear of small things in the face of nature's indifference. She flinched visibly when a heavy branch struck the roof, her shoulders rising toward her ears in a defensive posture. But beneath the fear, I saw a fascination. She was leaning toward the screen, not away from it. It was the look of someone who had been holding herself together for so long that seeing the world fall apart felt like permission. "It's just noise," I said, my voice pitched low, designed to slide under the thunder rather than compete with it. I settled into the chair, taking a slow, deliberate sip of the wine. It was earthy, complex, grounding. The house is anchored deep into the bedrock. We aren't going anywhere. She turned to me then, and the look she gave me was complex. Part disbelief, part relief. She was searching my face for cracks, for any sign that I was performing this calm for her benefit. I wasn't. I held her gaze, unflinching. I was the anchor here. In this room, amidst the howling wind, I was the steady thing. It was a role I fell into with practiced ease, the calm center of the spinning wheel. I saw her shoulders drop an inch. She took a sip of the wine, closing her eyes as the liquid hit her tongue. The wind shifted, slamming against the south face of the porch, sending a fine mist of water through the screen. It dampened the slate near her feet, but she didn't pull back. The scent of the storm, crushed pine needles, salt spray, and wet earth, mingled with the notes of the wine. It was intoxicating. The air felt thick, pressurized, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Every crash of thunder felt like a heartbeat, skipping. "I've never seen it like this," she admitted, her voice soft, almost lost in the din. "It feels personal, like it's trying to get in." "It wants to," I agreed, swirling the wine in my glass, watching the red legs run down the crystal. "That's the point of this place, to be close enough to feel the teeth of it without getting bitten." She looked around the room, at the velvet cushions, the swaying ferns, the shadows stretching long and thin as the lamp flickered again. The contrast was stark, the violence just inches away from the soft comfort she was curled into. "You live like this?" she asked, her eyes finding mine again. "On the edge?" "I live with the view," I corrected. Sometimes the view pushes back. The conversation was drifting, unmooring from the immediate crisis of the kayak and the cold water. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the slow burn of the alcohol and the strange, suspended reality of the storm. We weren't just survivor and rescuer anymore. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, with the weight of 2 lives suddenly colliding in the dark. The storm entrapped us, yes, but it had also cleared the board. There was nowhere to go. Nothing to do but drink the wine and let the truth rise to the surface. "You weren't just out for a paddle," I said. It wasn't a question. I swirled the Pinot Noir in my glass, watching the dark liquid coat the crystal, heavy and slow. Nobody fights the October tide in the dark unless they're running away from something on land. She didn't answer immediately. She brought the glass to her lips, taking a long, deliberate swallow, her eyes closed as if she were trying to taste the silence of the room rather than the wine. When she lowered the glass, her hand was trembling, a minute, almost imperceptible vibration that rippled the surface of the red wine. It was the only betrayal of a composure she was fighting hard to rebuild. "Is it that obvious?" she asked, her voice rougher now, stripped of the polite veneer she'd worn on the deck. "You were halfway to the Atlantic in a plastic boat," I countered softly. "That's not recreation. That's an exit strategy." She let out a breath that was half laugh, half sigh, and leaned her head back against the velvet cushions. The movement exposed the long, pale line of her throat, a vulnerable expanse of skin that drew my gaze and held it. "I felt like I was suffocating," she admitted, the words tumbling out as if the wine had unlocked a pressure valve. "The city, it's not just the noise, it's the visibility. I felt like I was living in a display case." I watched her as she spoke, mapping the emotional geography of her confession. She wasn't just talking about a job or an apartment. She was describing a cage. She spoke of a life that looked perfect on paper. The high-rise, the career, the partner who curated their existence like a gallery exhibit, but felt like a slow asphyxiation. Her description was precise, clinical, but beneath the words, I could hear the fracture lines. My ex, she loved the idea of us, she said, her fingers tightening around the stem of the glass until her knuckles turned white. But she didn't see me. Not really. I was just another polished surface in her life. I woke up this morning, looked at the ceiling, and realized I couldn't take one more breath in that apartment. I listened, not just to the story, but to the way her body told it. This was the intimate cartography I knew well. Reading the tension held in the slope of a shoulder, the defensive set of a jaw, the way she curled her legs beneath her as if trying to make herself smaller, harder to target. She was a woman who had been eroding for a long time, worn down by the friction of constant, low-level expectation. "So you drove until the road ended," I supplied, recognizing the pattern. "I drove until I hit water," she corrected, turning her head to look at me. Her eyes were dark, searching. I saw the rental stand. I didn't check the weather. I didn't check the tide. I just needed to be out, away from the concrete, away from the feeling of being watched. "And you found the one place where the ocean tries to swallow you whole," I murmured. "It felt real," she whispered, the admission hanging in the damp air between us. Fighting the current, the cold. It was the first time in months I felt like I was actually in my own body. Until I flipped. The storm rattled the screens again, a violent reminder of the chaos she had invited in. But in here, the confession had shifted the atmosphere. The space between us, previously defined by the awkwardness of rescue, was now bridged by a shared frequency. I knew that need, the desperate, clawing desire to sever the tether and drift. "I didn't build this house for the view," I said, leaning forward, resting my elbows on my knees. The movement brought me inches closer to her sphere. "I built it because out here, the only thing that demands my attention is the weather. The phone doesn't ring, the expectations stop at the bridge. I understand the need to run until you hit the edge of the map." She looked at me then, really looked at me, stripping away the rescuer archetype to see the woman beneath. Her gaze was heavy, weighted with a sudden, sharp recognition. It was a look that said, "You are hiding too." "We're a pair, aren't we?" she said softly, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Shipwrecked in a storm, hiding from the world." "There are worse places to be stranded," I replied, my voice dropping an octave, the words vibrating in the small space. The sudden, terrifying clarity of being seen acted like a solvent, dissolving the last of the polite distance. We were two refugees of the noise, sheltering in the same quiet, and the relief was heady. The storm raged on, but the only current that mattered now was the one pulling across the slate floor between us. The silence that followed her confession wasn't empty. It was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against the backs of our throats. The storm outside had ceased to be a threat and had become a perimeter, a wall of noise and water that sealed us into this amber-lit stillness. The atmosphere in the sun porch shifted. A sudden, undeniable static filled the space. Tension that had nothing to do with the lightning and everything to do with the woman sitting 3 feet away. The polite distance of the rescue evaporated. I set my wine glass down on the teak table. The sound of the crystal touching the wood was sharp, a punctuation mark ending the conversation about the past. I didn't lean back into the safety of my chair. Instead, I stood up. I didn't walk away. I walked toward her. I moved to the daybed, the slate floor cool through my socks, and sat down on the edge of the velvet cushion. The mattress dipped under my weight, shifting the gravity of the room, pulling her imperceptibly toward me. She didn't retreat. She didn't pull her legs back or straighten her spine into a defensive posture. She watched me, her eyes dark and unreadable in the low light, tracking my movement with a focus that felt like a physical touch. I was close enough now to smell the eucalyptus soap on her skin, clean and sharp beneath the earthy scent of the wine. I was close enough to see the pulse fluttering at the base of her throat, a frantic, bird-like rhythm that betrayed the stillness of her body. "The storm isn't letting up," I said, my voice dropping to a register that was intimate, meant only for the space between us. "No," she whispered. "It isn't." Her knee brushed mine. It was a casual accident of geometry, a grazing of denim against the soft fleece she wore. But the contact sent a shock through me that was immediate and electric. Neither of us moved away. The heat of her legs seeped through the layers of fabric, a steady, radiating warmth that anchored me. The proximity was intoxicating. It was a silent negotiation, a testing of boundaries that were rapidly dissolving. I looked at her, really looked at her, tracing the line of her jaw, the curve of her mouth, the damp hair that had dried into wild, dark waves against her neck. She looked wrecked and beautiful, a creature of the storm who had found her way into my sanctuary. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. It was heavy with unsaid intent, with the realization that the kayak, the cold water, the rescue, all of it had been leading to this precise coordinate in time. I reached out. My hand moved slowly, telegraphing the intent, giving her every second to pull away. She didn't. I brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek, my fingers lingering on the warm skin of her jawline. Her breath hitched, a sharp intake of air that was loud in the quiet room. She leaned into my touch, just a fraction, a subtle surrender that shattered the last of my restraint. "You're safe here," I murmured, my thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "I know," she breathed. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then back up to my eyes, dark and unflinching. I closed the distance. The kiss wasn't tentative. It was slow, deliberate, a reading of intentions. I felt the precise texture of her lips, soft and tasting of Pinot Noir, and the metallic tang of the storm. It was a kiss that held the weight of everything unsaid, the fear of the water, the relief of the air, the loneliness of the city she'd fled, and the solitude I'd built around myself. It was a collision of needs. She made a low sound in her throat, a vibration I felt against my own lips, and her hand came up to grip the collar of my shirt, pulling me closer. The kiss deepened, shifting from exploration to claim. My hand slid into her hair, tangling in the damp waves, holding her steady as the world outside continued to rage. We weren't just waiting out the rain anymore. We were exactly where we were supposed to be. I woke to the light. It wasn't the gray, filtered gloom of the storm anymore. It was a sharp, relentless gold that sliced through the bronze screens of the sun porch, turning the dust motes into suspended glitter. The air smelled different, cleaner, sharper. The heavy scent of ozone and fear had been washed away, replaced by the briny mineral tang of low tide and drying cedar. I lay still for a moment, orienting myself. The daybed, usually a solitary island for reading, was crowded. The weight against my side was solid, warm, and undeniably real. She was asleep, her face pressed into the crook of my shoulder, one hand resting loosely on my chest. In the harsh, unforgiving clarity of morning, the intensity of a storm-born encounter usually dissolves into the awkward geometry of regret. I waited for it, the urge to pull away, the sudden need for boundaries. It didn't come. Instead, I felt a strange, quiet anchoring. The storm had passed, but the connection hadn't washed out with the tide. I extricated myself slowly, moving with the careful precision of a bomb disposal technician. She stirred, murmuring something unintelligible into the velvet cushion, her brow furrowing before smoothing out again. I paused, watching her. In sleep, the lines of exhaustion around her eyes had softened. She looked younger, less armored than the woman who had climbed out of the ocean. She looked like she belonged here, tangled in my fleece blanket, breathing my air. I walked into the main house, the slate floor cool under my bare feet. The silence was profound. The wind that had screamed through the eaves all night was gone, leaving behind a stillness so deep it felt heavy. I moved to the kitchen, the routine of morning grounding me. I ground the beans, a dark, oily roast that smelled of earth and smoke. The noise of the grinder felt violent in the quiet house, a mechanical intrusion, but it didn't wake her. While the coffee brewed, dripping its dark promise into the carafe, I stepped out onto the deck. The destruction was minimal, scattered palm fronds, a few overturned planters, but the world felt rewritten. The sky was a bruised, brilliant blue, scrubbed raw by the wind. I walked to the railing and scanned the channel. The water was glass flat, moving with a deceptive, lazy rhythm. I looked for a flash of yellow plastic, for any sign of the kayak that had brought her here. There was nothing. It was gone, swept out past the jetty, just another piece of drift in the Atlantic. I poured 2 mugs, the ceramic thick and warm in my hands. When I returned to the porch, the light had shifted, falling across the foot of the bed. She was sitting up, the blanket pooled around her waist, looking disoriented and soft in my oversized shirt. She blinked against the glare, shielding her eyes with a hand. Then she saw me. The memory of the night, the wine, the confession, the way the air had shifted between us, flooded her face. I saw the flush start at her throat and rise to her cheeks. But she didn't look away. She didn't pull the blanket up to cover herself. She just held my gaze, her eyes clear and green in the morning light. "Coffee," I said, extending the mug. It was a peace offering, a domestic anchor in the shifting sands of the morning after. She took a sip, closing her eyes as the steam hit her face. "The storm?" she asked, her voice husky with sleep, a sound that did things to my chest. "Gone," I told her, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "The world is washed clean." She took a sip, closing her eyes as the steam hit her face. "My boat is definitely gone, isn't it?" "Likely halfway to the shipping lanes by now," I said. "You're stranded." She looked at me over the rim of the mug. The panic was gone. Here, in the quiet, with the smell of coffee and the sun warming the slate, the loss of the kayak didn't feel like a disaster. It felt like a decision the universe had made for us. "I don't think I mind," she admitted softly. I leaned in, not touching her yet, but close enough to feel the heat radiating from her skin. "Good, because I wasn't planning on driving you to the bus station anytime soon." She smiled then, a slow, unfolding expression that reached her eyes. She leaned into me, her shoulder pressing against mine, a simple, heavy weight that felt like a promise. "I have nowhere to be," she whispered. "Then stay," I said. "The coffee is fresh, and the view is better when the sun is out." It wasn't an ending. The wreckage was cleared, the water was calm, and the day was just beginning. The kayak was lost, yes, but looking at her, settled and steady in my sanctuary, I knew I had found something far more permanent in the debris. The door clicked shut on the storm, but opened something else entirely. We stood there, in the quiet morning light, the wreckage of her escape lost to the tide, but a new course charted right there on the sun porch. Sometimes you have to capsize to find solid ground. If you've ever found clarity in the middle of chaos, tell me in the comments. And for more stories about storms and sanctuaries, subscribe.